The rain hadn't stopped since the funeral ended. Clarice stood just outside the wrought-iron gate of the Monroe estate, her black shoes soaked, the hem of her gray cardigan clinging to her ankles. Behind her, the last of the luxury cars reversed out of the circular driveway. In front of her, the same guard who had nodded at her for 12 years now held up one hand like she was a stranger. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, eyes blank. "Family only." Clarice didn't speak. She simply lowered her eyes, clutched her handbag tighter, and nodded. There was nothing else to do. The man she had nursed through heart medication, silent dinners, and strokes of loneliness. The man whose favorite tea she brewed every night at 9 p.m., like clockwork, had just been lowered into the ground that morning. And now the people who hadn't seen him in years were locking her out of the house she'd kept breathing. "You shouldn't be here," came a sharper voice. Grayson Monroe, the eldest son, had returned from New York just in time for the will, not for the care or the final weeks. Dressed in a rain-proof navy overcoat and with perfect posture, he stepped forward from under the portico. His expression was cold and tired of pretending. "You're just the help," he said. "My father is gone. That means your services are no longer required." Clarice blinked once. "I only wanted to get the teacup," she said quietly. "It's still warm." Grayson scoffed. "I'm sure it is, but the staff entrance is now sealed." The gate shut with a metallic click. She turned and walked back towards the sidewalk, the mansion disappearing behind her like fog retreating into the earth. She had almost reached the corner when she heard her name. "Ms. Reynolds?" A man in a long black coat was walking quickly across the driveway, holding a leather folder under his arm. He looked nothing like the Monroes. Darker skin, gray streak in his beard, rain soaking through his sleeves. It took her a second to recognize him. "Elena's assistant?" she asked. He nodded. "I'm from Cruz and Spaulding. Elena Cruz sent me to deliver something urgently. It wasn't meant to be opened until after the service." He held out a sealed envelope. It was old, the edges yellowed, the handwriting unmistakable. "Nathaniel Monroe, private, for Clarice Reynolds. To be opened after my death." She stared at it. Her hands trembled slightly as she took it. "There's something else," the assistant added, pointing towards the mansion. "He left it in the piano bench, said it was safest there." Clarice froze. For 12 years, she had never touched the piano. It was sacred, the only place Nathaniel allowed dust to gather. His wife had loved to play, long before Clarice ever stepped foot in the house. "What did he leave?" she asked. The man shook his head. "I don't know," he said, "but I was told this—" He nodded towards the envelope. "Would explain everything." Clarice held the letter against her chest. The rain had stopped, but inside her, a storm had only just begun. 12 years earlier, the Monroe estate had looked just as intimidating as it did now. Tall iron gates, gravel so clean it seemed unnatural, windows that reflected your own doubt back at you. Clarice had arrived holding a single suitcase and a reference letter folded into fourths. She was 53 then. Not young, not old, not broken, but hollowed. The woman who greeted her at the side door, Mrs. Latham, the housekeeper, had said with polite suspicion, "He prefers quiet, and he doesn't like questions." That was fine. Clarice had run out of questions the day they buried her son. She had once been an ICU nurse, trained to move between chaos and order like a switch. But when the gas explosion tore through her apartment building and left her with no family to care for, she stepped out of scrubs and into silence. Nathaniel Monroe didn't need a caregiver, not at first. He needed someone discreet, capable, and clean. What he got was someone who watched quietly, listened carefully, and brewed tea with the same reverence as performing surgery. She never used the main entrance. She memorized his routines within a week. Breakfast alone, lunch skipped, dinner at 6:15 sharp. At night he'd play nothing on the piano, just sit with one hand on the keys. The mansion was always quiet, like a museum of grief. His wife had passed 3 years before. There were no photos on display, only a faded portrait in the hallway she was told never to clean. Clarice knew her place, not because someone told her, but because grief has a way of recognizing itself in silence. One evening, 6 months into the job, Clarice made a mistake. Nathaniel had forgotten to take his evening pills. When she reminded him, gently placing the cup near his hand, he snapped, "Do not speak to me unless I ask you to." His voice was cold, but his eyes looked like they regretted it the moment the words left. Clarice didn't cry, not in front of him. That night, in the back pantry where she kept her uniform folded and her real emotions hidden, she wrote a resignation letter. She folded it neatly, like the reference letter before, and placed it in her handbag. But she didn't hand it in, because that same night, when she went to clean the teacup from the side table, she noticed he had taken the pills. And not only that, he had placed the cup back on its saucer with a linen napkin underneath. It was the first time he had done that. The next morning, he asked if she had always been this precise. She replied, "Only when it matters." He didn't respond. But when she turned away, he said, softly, like tasting a word for the first time, "It matters." From then on, their routine remained unspoken, but synchronized. She brewed his tea at 9 p.m. He never asked, but he was always waiting. She walked past the piano without touching it. He never played, but always sat there as if someone might. They never became friends, never needed to. Clarice wore gloves, not just to protect her hands, but to protect the boundary between service and sentiment. But somewhere between the untouched piano and the untouched pain, a kind of trust settled between them. It was quiet, but it mattered. 12 years earlier, the Monroe estate had looked just as intimidating as it did now. Tall iron gates, gravel so clean it seemed unnatural, windows that reflected your own doubt back at you. Clarice had arrived holding a single suitcase and a reference letter folded into fourths. She was 53 then, not young, not old, not broken, but hollowed. The woman who greeted her at the side door, Mrs. Latham, the housekeeper, had said with polite suspicion, "He prefers quiet, and he doesn't like questions." That was fine. Clarice had run out of questions the day they buried her son. She had once been an ICU nurse, trained to move between chaos and order like a switch. But when the gas explosion tore through her apartment building and left her with no family to care for, she stepped out of scrubs and into silence. Nathaniel Monroe didn't need a caregiver, not at first. He needed someone discreet, capable, and clean. What he got was someone who watched quietly, listened carefully, and brewed tea with the same reverence as performing surgery. She never used the main entrance. She memorized his routines within a week. Breakfast alone, lunch skipped, dinner at 6:15 sharp. At night he'd play nothing on the piano, just sit with one hand on the keys. The mansion was always quiet, like a museum of grief. His wife had passed 3 years before. There were no photos on display, only a faded portrait in the hallway she was told never to clean. Clarice knew her place, not because someone told her, but because grief has a way of recognizing itself in silence. One evening, 6 months into the job, Clarice made a mistake. Nathaniel had forgotten to take his evening pills. When she reminded him, gently placing the cup near his hand, he snapped, "Do not speak to me unless I ask you to." His voice was cold, but his eyes looked like they regretted it the moment the words left. Clarice didn't cry, not in front of him. That night, in the back pantry where she kept her uniform folded and her real emotions hidden, she wrote a resignation letter. She folded it neatly, like the reference letter before, and placed it in her handbag. But she didn't hand it in, because that same night, when she went to clean the teacup from the side table, she noticed he had taken the pills. And not only that, he had placed the cup back on its saucer with a linen napkin underneath. It was the first time he had done that. The next morning he asked if she had always been this precise. She replied, "Only when it matters." He didn't respond. But when she turned away, he said softly, like tasting a word for the first time, "It matters." From then on, their routine remained unspoken but synchronized. She brewed his tea at 9 p.m. He never asked, but he was always waiting. She walked past the piano without touching it. He never played, but always sat there as if someone might. They never became friends. Never needed to. Clarice wore gloves, not just to protect her hands, but to protect the boundary between service and sentiment. But somewhere between the untouched piano and the untouched pain, a kind of trust settled between them. It was quiet, but it mattered. The morning after Grayson's visit, Clarice found something unusual in the study. The piano room had always been left untouched, a time capsule of loss, of silence. But the door was ajar, and the faint scent of Nathaniel's cologne lingered in the air. Inside, the piano bench was slightly pulled back. She didn't touch it, not yet. Instead, she focused on the desk. On it sat a sealed letter, addressed not to her but to Elena Cruz, his attorney, and beneath it, a legal notepad with just 3 words written in Nathaniel's unmistakable handwriting. Final, no copies. That week, Nathaniel met with Elena privately. Clarice wasn't in the room, but she saw the signs. The locked briefcase, the new witnesses arriving midday, the notary's pen clicking like a loaded gun. She heard the muted tones behind the closed door. Not of weakness, but determination. Later that day, he asked Clarice to bring him his wife's old photo, the one Clarice had never been allowed to clean. She brought it without a word. He stared at it for a long time, then set it on the mantel. Clarice noticed that his hands didn't tremble. Over the next few months, Nathaniel began preparing without saying goodbye. He recorded a video. Elena set up the lighting. Dr. Matthew Lynn, his neurologist, evaluated him twice during the process. Once at rest, once mid-conversation. "He's clear," Dr. Lynn told Elena. "Not just coherent, intentional." The charitable trust was filed, a quiet, sealed document, designating 80% of his estate to a foundation he'd name after his late wife, with Clarice as its trustee. She would inherit the house, not as a gift, but as a guardian of what had been built. And the children? Each would receive a letter, not a check, not a clause, but a letter explaining why trust was no longer theirs to hold. Clarice, of course, knew none of this. To her, the days continued as always. Meals, medicines, rain on the window panes. But there were subtle changes. Nathaniel sat in the sunroom more often. He asked for jazz on the record player instead of silence. One afternoon, she found a new teacup on the tray. Not one from the Monroe china set, but a simple white one. "No emblem, no family crest. I thought you deserved one of your own," he said. Clarice didn't respond. But when he looked away, she gently replaced her gloves with bare hands. That was the only answer he needed. It was early spring when Nathaniel died. The cherry trees had just begun to bloom, their petals brushing against the windows like fingers trying to hold on. Clarice found him in the sunroom, slouched peacefully in his chair, the morning light resting gently on his face. One hand still rested on the armrest, and his teacup sat full beside him, untouched. She didn't cry. She folded his blanket, closed his eyes, called Elena first, then the doctor. It wasn't her first death, but it felt like the last. The funeral was quiet by design. Nathaniel had asked for no eulogy, no speeches, just music. So Clarice had chosen his favorite, Ella Fitzgerald's "I'll Be Seeing You." It echoed through the hall like a memory that didn't want to leave. His children arrived late. Rachel wore sunglasses the entire time. Grayson checked his watch during the final hymn. None of them spoke to Clarice. She stayed to clean up after the service, not because she had to, but because she couldn't yet leave. That's when Grayson made it official. He approached her near the side garden, where she was folding one last tablecloth. "You've done your part," he said flatly. "We'll handle things from here." Clarice looked up. "I'd like to return his teacup to the cabinet." He smiled, not kindly. "This isn't your home anymore." She didn't argue, just nodded. She'd expected it in some way, but it still cut deeper than she'd thought it would. The next morning she returned with a small bag, just to gather her belongings from the staff quarters. Her gloves, a photo of her son tucked in a drawer, the book Nathaniel had once asked her to read. But the gate wouldn't open. The same security guard she had seen nearly every morning for 12 years stepped forward, holding up his palm. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, not unkindly. "Mr. Monroe's son gave strict orders. No staff re-entry without clearance." Clarice stood in the rain, still as stone. In the distance, Grayson watched from the front door. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He just turned around and went back inside. Clarice left without her gloves. She didn't look back. But inside her bag, tucked between her folded cardigan and that dog-eared book, was the envelope from Elena. And inside her heart, something was beginning to rise. Not anger, not revenge. Something quieter, but far more powerful. A memory that refused to stay buried. 3 days after the funeral, Clarice received a call. "Elena Cruz would like you present for the reading of Mr. Monroe's last directives," the assistant said. Clarice hesitated. "I thought I'd already been dismissed." There was a pause. Then, "You were never dismissed by him." The law firm of Cruz and Spaulding sat on the 12th floor of a quiet building downtown. The room they used for the reading had a long oak table, glass pitchers of water, and chairs that felt too stiff to sit in comfortably. Grayson arrived first, alone, with his phone already buzzing in one hand. Rachel followed, looking bored and overdressed. David, the estranged half-brother, came last. He didn't speak, but nodded once to Clarice. Clarice sat at the far end of the table, unsure if she was supposed to. Elena Cruz entered with quiet authority, carrying a slim black folder and a flash drive. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "As you know, Mr. Monroe updated his estate instructions 5 months ago. They were properly notarized, witnessed, and verified for legal capacity." Grayson scoffed audibly. "If you're about to tell us he left everything to the maid, you'll be hearing from our attorney." Elena didn't flinch. "You're welcome to file, Mr. Monroe, but you may want to hear what your father had to say first." She inserted the flash drive into the screen at the end of the room. The video was simple. Nathaniel sat in the piano room, a fire glowing beside him. He looked older, frailer, but his voice was strong. "To my children," he began, "I know my choices won't make sense to you, but you didn't see what I saw." He paused, folded his hands. "You weren't there when I couldn't speak, when I couldn't hold a pen. Clarice was. She didn't just serve this house. She saved me inside it." He looked off camera, then back. "You called her the help, but she helped in ways none of you ever did." Gasps filled the room. Rachel muttered a curse. David exhaled slowly, almost sadly. Grayson looked ready to stand, but didn't. Elena picked up the folder. Per Mr. Monroe's directives, 80% of his assets, including this property, 2 satellite homes, and all foundation funds, are to be placed into the Monroe Legacy Trust. She looked toward Clarice. "And Ms. Clarice Reynolds is named as the sole trustee." Grayson slammed his fist on the table. "This is insane." Elena turned to him, calm but firm. "You're each entitled to a personal letter from your father. They are not legal documents, but they are his final words to you. Would you like yours now?" Nobody moved. So she placed the letters down, one for each child, sealed in envelopes with their names written in that same slow, elegant script. Then she turned back to Clarice. "And finally, Mr. Monroe left one additional note for you. It was found beneath the piano bench, as instructed." She handed Clarice a second envelope, smaller, yellowed, and worn at the corners. Clarice took it with trembling hands. She didn't open it. Not yet. She didn't need to, because for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she had to prove she belonged in the room. The elevator ride down was silent. Clarice kept the envelope pressed flat against her chest, as if it might evaporate if she let go. Elena offered to call her a car, but she shook her head. I'd rather walk. Outside, the clouds hung low, and the city felt too loud, as if it hadn't just witnessed something that changed her entire world. She sat on a bench at the far end of Brookline Park, the one with the cracked wood and the peeling green paint. It had always been her place when she needed to think. She hadn't needed it in years, but now the weight of everything sat heavy in her lap. The trust, the house, the foundation, the spotlight she never asked for. She opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a letter, handwritten, simple. Clarice, if you're reading this, it means I am no longer around to defend your character, which means the world will try to define it for you. They will call you a thief, a liar, a manipulator. And I need you to remember, you are none of those things. You are the reason I lived my final years with dignity. Nathaniel. Below that, a postscript. If you don't take what I've given, they will turn my memory into something I never meant, and they will tear down everything you quietly built. Please, don't let silence win this time. Clarice folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, but her hands were shaking because he had given her more than a fortune. He had given her responsibility, legacy, and a future she wasn't sure she wanted. The next day, headlines hit. Maid inherits $48 million estate. Controversial Will Sparks outrage among Monroe heirs. Who is Clarice Reynolds? They dug into her past. Her nursing license, the gas explosion. Photos of her wiping down windows ran beside headlines designed to question her worth. She turned off the TV, ignored the phone, refused interviews. On the third night, Clarice brewed tea, just for herself. She poured it into the plain white cup Nathaniel had given her. Sat at the table, stared out the window at the empty estate across the street, and for the first time in days, she whispered something to herself. I never wanted his fortune. She looked down at her hands, ungloved now. I just wanted to be forgotten with dignity. But the world had made its choice, and now it was her turn to make hers. A month passed. The Monroe Legacy Foundation opened its doors on May 14th, the date Nathaniel had met his wife, not the day he died. Clarice insisted on it. The building was modest, modern, and far from the mansion, tucked between a free clinic and a food pantry in a forgotten corner of Savannah. No chandeliers, no marble, just clean walls, warm lights, and a plaque that read, Monroe Legacy Foundation for dignity in life and death. Clarice didn't cut the ribbon. She simply unlocked the door. Grayson and Rachel never challenged the will. Perhaps they were warned by their lawyers, or perhaps, deep down, they understood that even if they won a case, they'd lose something far greater. The narrative. Instead, they faded from the news cycle. A few tabloids tried to chase a scandal, but the public had made up its mind. They loved Clarice, not because she was wealthy, but because she hadn't wanted to be. She still lived in the Monroe mansion, not out of pride, but practicality. She kept the tea schedule. She still used the side entrance. But now, when she opened the piano bench, it wasn't to clean. It was to store donation envelopes, volunteer rosters, thank you letters from patients who finally found care through the foundation. One morning, she placed a framed photo on top of the piano. It was the only one in the house. It showed her holding hands with Nathaniel, not smiling, not posing, just sitting side by side in quiet conversation. It had been taken by accident by one of the nurses. But it was perfect, because it was real. That night, Clarice brewed 2 cups of tea, one for herself and one for the empty seat across from her, the one that had always belonged to him. She set it down gently, then sat at the piano for the very first time. Her fingers didn't play, but they rested on the keys, and in that silence, she finally heard something. Not music, not words, just peace.